him a manila envelope, set it on the hospital tray beside his untouched Jell-O, and told him she was leaving. He had been in that bed for 11 days. His left leg was in traction. 3 ribs were cracked on the right side, and every breath reminded him. The accident had happened on a Tuesday morning in November on the I-77 overpass outside Charlotte when a panel truck ran a red light at 62 miles per hour and hit his work truck on the driver's side with a force the investigating officer later described as catastrophic. Marcus had been a structural engineer for 16 years. He understood the physics of what had happened to his body. He understood it in the way that made it worse. Simone set the envelope on the tray without meeting his eyes. She said the marriage had run its course. She said she needed someone who could keep up. She said it with a kind of practiced calm that told him she had rehearsed it in the car on the way over. She had no idea that the accident had given him something she never thought to calculate. 14 months of recovery. 14 months in which Marcus Ellison, with one good leg and a laptop and the kind of stillness that pain teaches, would build the things she never believed he was capable of building. By the time Simone showed up at his office door with a lawyer and a claim for spousal assets, Marcus Owen Ellison was the sole owner of a structural engineering consultancy valued at $5.6 million. Funded and built during the period she had already legally left. Before we jump into the story is one you need to hear. The alarm went off at 5:12 a.m. The morning of the accident, same as every other morning. Marcus had set it that way for 11 years, since the first day he took a job with Mead and Associates and decided he would never be the last one to the site. He dressed in the dark, the same way he always did. Dark Carhartt jacket. Steel-toed boots he laced from the bottom without sitting down. A thermos he filled with black coffee, no sugar, and screwed the lid on tight because a loose thermos lid was a waste of coffee, and Marcus Ellison did not waste things. He drove a 2016 Ford F-150 with 118,000 miles on it, and a long diagonal scratch along the passenger door from a rebar incident 3 years earlier that he had never bothered to fix. The truck ran fine. The scratch was cosmetic. Marcus was not a cosmetic kind of man. He had been with Mead and Associates for 9 years by that November. Senior structural engineer. The firm handled commercial and industrial contracts across the Carolinas, warehouses, bridges, a handful of municipal buildings. Marcus was the one they sent to sites when something looked wrong in the preliminary drawings, when a contractor was cutting corners on load-bearing specifications, when the math didn't line up with the steel in the ground. He had a way of walking a site that other engineers described as unhurried and that foremen described as thorough. He moved from point to point with a yellow legal pad and an orange chalk marker, and when he found a problem, he marked it on the floor, or the wall, or the column face, in clear, deliberate strokes. And then he wrote it down in language a foreman could read, and clipped it where it would be found. He had been doing this for 16 years. He had never had a structural failure on a site he had signed. The morning of the accident, he was heading to a warehouse project in Concord, a 40-minute drive from the house in Mint Hill that he and Simone had bought 6 years earlier. He remembered the drive because it was cold and the heater was running, and there was a sports segment on the radio he was only half listening to. He remembered the light being green. He did not remember the impact. He remembered waking up in the hospital 2 days later with Simone sitting beside him and her hand not quite reaching his. They had been married for 12 years. They had met at a firm picnic, which sounds unremarkable until you understand that Marcus had almost not gone. He had work to finish. He had a site review the next morning. His colleague Raymond had pulled him by the jacket sleeve and told him to stop being a statue and come outside for 2 hours. Marcus had gone. Simone was standing by the drink table in a yellow dress, and she had laughed at something someone said, and the laugh was so genuine and uncalculated that Marcus had walked directly over to her, which was not something he was known for doing. They were good together for a while. He was steady. She was bright and quick and socially fluent in all the ways he sometimes wasn't. And she smoothed the edges of rooms he walked into, and he admired that about her genuinely. She worked in marketing for a regional healthcare network, and she was good at it. She had a talent for identifying what people wanted to hear and giving it to them in the precise packaging that made them feel they had arrived at the thought themselves. The problem was not that they were wrong for each other at the beginning. The problem was that somewhere in the 7th or 8th year, Simone had begun measuring Marcus by a different scale. He couldn't name the exact moment it started. It announced itself in accumulation. The small corrections at dinner parties when he mentioned salary in the abstract. The way she described him to new acquaintances. He's an engineer, structural, so not the glamorous kind. With a half smile that invited the listener to agree that glamour was the reasonable standard. The Tuesday evenings she stopped coming home until after 9 without explanation. The trip to Atlanta she took with her colleague Darren that she mentioned the night before and described, when he asked about it, as a planning retreat, with a tone that suggested he should feel fortunate she'd mentioned it at all. The expensive shower gel appeared 6 months before the accident. French label, imported, $64 a bottle. It filled the master bathroom every morning with a scent that was not unpleasant, but that was entirely hers, not theirs. A luxury she had purchased for herself without mentioning the cost, and it an ordinary thing. He noticed it. He said nothing. He was, as Simone had once said to her sister on a phone call he had not been meant to hear, the kind of man who noticed things and processed them in silence and never made anyone feel better about it. The manila envelope arrived on day 11. Marcus was watching the television mounted to the wall across from his bed, not watching it exactly, staring at it with the particular unfocused attention of a man on pain medication who is doing most of his actual thinking 3 feet below the surface of his face. The door opened. Simone came in wearing the camel coat he had bought her 2 Christmases ago and her work bag over one shoulder, and she looked, he thought, very put together for someone visiting a person with cracked ribs and a leg in traction. She set the envelope on the tray. She told him she was sorry about the timing, but said there was never really a good time for this kind of thing. She said the marriage had run its course. She said she had been unhappy for a long time and he probably knew it, and she said this in a way that implied his knowing it and his failing to do anything about it were the same thing. She said she needed someone who could keep up. He looked at the envelope. He looked at her. He said, "Okay." She waited for more. There was no more. She left 11 minutes after she arrived. The door made a soft sound behind her. The ventilation system ran in the wall. Marcus reached over with his right hand and picked up the envelope and held it without opening it for a long time. He opened it eventually. The papers were standard. Irreconcilable differences. She had already retained a Charlotte family law attorney named Whitfield. The filing date was 3 days earlier. She had filed before she came. He sat with that for a while, the architecture of it, the preparation, the fact that she had built the exit before she walked in to announce it. He set the papers on the tray beside the Jell-O. He did not call anyone that night. He turned the television off and lay in the dark and thought about the warehouse in Concord and whether the anchor bolt spacing on the east foundation had been resolved before he went out to check it. It had. He had flagged it 2 weeks earlier in language the foreman could not miss. He thought about this and was satisfied by it in the specific, clean way he was satisfied when a problem had been correctly addressed. Then he closed his eyes and worked on going to sleep, which took a while because of the ribs and because of other things. But he did it. The attorney his colleague Raymond found for him was a divorce lawyer named Celeste Okafor, who had practiced family law in Mecklenburg County for 19 years, and whose office walls held degrees from Spelman and Unk's School of Law beside a framed print that read, "Precision wins more cases than passion." She met with Marcus 6 days after his discharge at his house in Mint Hill because he was still on crutches and could not comfortably navigate her third-floor office. She sat at his kitchen table with a yellow legal pad of her own and asked him to walk her through the marriage and the filing. He walked her through it methodically. Assets acquired during marriage. Assets acquired before. His income. Her income. The equity in the house. He had brought a folder of documents, tax returns, account statements, the mortgage, his pension. She looked through them and made notes and then looked up. She said, "This are of marital assets and nothing more. The house equity, the joint savings, half the pension accrued during marriage. Your professional credentials and future income are yours." He said he understood. She said, "Given the circumstances of the filing, you were hospitalized. I can argue bad faith if she pushes on the settlement." "She may push." He said, "She'll push." There was a pause. Celeste looked at him with the specific look of an attorney assessing a client's composure. He met it steadily. She said, "All right." "Then we prepare." His friend Raymond came over on Sundays. Raymond was a project manager at Meade, tall and broad and constitutionally incapable of sitting still, and he would arrive at 10 with food he had bought at the deli near his apartment, and he would set it out on the counter and talk while Marcus ate. The first Sunday, he said he could not believe this. He said it several times in different registers. He said he had always liked Simone, but he had also always thought there was something, and then he stopped himself and said, "I'm sorry, man, this is wrong." The timing alone. Marcus said, "She's not wrong that she was unhappy." Raymond said, "She filed while you were in the hospital." Marcus said, "I know." Raymond said, "That's not," and then stopped again. Marcus said, "Sit down. Eat something." Raymond sat. He ate. He stopped saying he could not believe it, because he could see that Marcus was not going to join him in that particular exercise, and that something else was operating behind his friend's face that needed room to work. What was operating, Raymond would not fully understand until much later, was a decision. Marcus had been a structural engineer for 16 years. The entire premise of his profession was load-bearing analysis, understanding what a structure was capable of holding, what it would collapse under, what it could be made to withstand with the right reinforcement in the right places. He had spent those 16 years building other people's structures. He had a particular instinct for it. He could look at a set of drawings and understand, before the calculations were run, where the vulnerabilities lived. He had tried to explain this instinct to Simone once, at a dinner party, and she had redirected the conversation with the particular fluency of someone who has decided the current topic is not worth the room's time. He lay on his back in his living room in the evenings that first month, leg elevated, laptop on a book on his chest, and he began to think about what he could build. Not for revenge. That was not the operating principle. The operating principle was simpler and older, and belonged to the part of him that had been filling a thermos and lacing his boots before sunrise for 11 years. The part that understood that work was not something you did when circumstances permitted, but something you did because it was the only honest answer to what circumstances did to you. He had been consulting on the side for 2 years. Small projects. Structural reviews for residential contractors, second opinions on commercial bids, a few municipal projects on nights and weekends. He had a reputation in those circles that was quiet and very specific, He was the engineer you called when the other engineer had missed something. He had 3 clients. He had, at that point, about $47,000 in a savings account that was in his name only, accumulated from consulting income that he had never mentioned to Simone because she had never asked about it. He spent the first month of recovery building a business plan on a legal pad, not because he needed the structure of a plan, but because he thought better with a pen in his hand and something concrete to look at. He outlined a consulting firm. Structural engineering services for mid-size commercial contractors who could not afford a full-time senior engineer. Contract reviews. Site assessment. Plan analysis. Liability-adjacent work. The kind that required someone who had been on enough job sites to know what cut corners looked like in a drawing before they appeared in steel. He was that person. He had been that person for 16 years. He had simply been doing it inside someone else's firm. He named the firm Ellison Structural. He thought about a different name for about 4 minutes and then used his own name because he was not in the habit of operating at a distance from his own work. He incorporated in January, 3 months after the accident, working with a business attorney Raymond's cousin had recommended. He used the $47,000 to cover the incorporation costs, a professional liability policy, a website that a young freelancer built for $600 and that was functional if not elegant, and a business checking account. He called his 3 existing consulting clients and told them he had gone independent. All 3 stayed. He called 12 contractors he had worked with over the years through Meade, men who had watched him mark problems in orange chalk and come back 3 days later to verify the fix, and told them the same thing. 7 of them called back. He was on crutches until late February. He did site visits from April onward, slowly, and then with increasing range as the leg healed. He drove to sites in the F-150 with a scratch on the passenger door. He carried his yellow legal pad and his orange chalk and his site notebook in the inside pocket of his Carhartt jacket. Nothing about the way he worked had changed. The only difference was that when he left the site, he was leaving his own site. The divorce was finalized in March, 14 months after the filing. The settlement was exactly what Celeste had projected. Half the house equity, $112,000 each. Half the joint savings, $44,000 each. A portion of the pension accrued during the marriage. Her car, which was in her name. His truck, which was in his. Simone had pushed, as he had told Celeste she would, on the consulting income. Celeste had demonstrated, with 11 months of bank records and the incorporation date, that Ellison Structural had been formed after the separation and all income therefrom was non-marital. Simone's attorney had argued. Celeste had been precise and unhurried in her response. The judge had sided with the documentation. What Simone did not know, because she had not thought to ask, was that by the time the divorce was finalized, Ellison Structural had contracts with 19 clients in 4 states and had recorded $1.1 million in gross revenue in its first full fiscal year. She had never once, in 12 years of marriage, asked Marcus what he thought his work was worth if he did it for himself. She had formed a picture and lived inside it, and it had never occurred to her to check whether the picture was complete. Marcus rented an office in March, a 4-room suite on the 2nd floor of a building in the South End. Functional space with good light and a conference room he used for client presentations. He hired an office manager named Denise, who had worked for a civil engineering firm for 8 years, and who organized the growing client files with the same systematic precision Marcus used in the field. He hired 2 junior engineers in the spring. He developed a quality review process that he documented himself, drawing on 16 years of site-level pattern recognition, and trained both of them through it over 6 weeks. He still drove the F-150. He still used the thermos, black coffee, no sugar. He still arrived before anyone else. By the end of the second full year, Ellison Structural had 31 active clients and a staff of 7. Revenue had climbed past $2.3 million. He had brought on a business development consultant, a quiet and thorough woman named Patricia Chen, who had spent a decade in commercial real estate and understood, better than Marcus wanted to, how to position a firm. She told him his reputation was his only marketing problem, that he had an extraordinary one and was doing nothing with it. He told her to handle it. She did. Within a year, Ellison Structural was listed in 2 regional contractor publications and had fielded inquiries from 3 infrastructure development groups working on public contracts. The valuation came in during the firm's 3rd year. Marcus had not initiated it. A private equity group out of Atlanta that had been tracking the firm's growth through one of their portfolio contractors had reached out through Patricia. They wanted to discuss a minority equity acquisition. Their due diligence team spent 6 weeks reviewing the firm's financials, contracts, client retention rates, and liability record. Marcus sat in on 2 of the review sessions with the same yellow legal pad he brought to site visits. At the end of the 6 weeks, the lead analyst put a term sheet on the table. The valuation they had assigned to Ellison Structural for the purpose of the acquisition discussion was $5.6 million. Marcus looked at the number. He thought about the warehouse in Concord. He thought about the anchor bolt spacing on the east foundation. He thought about the orange chalk and the legal pad and the note he had clipped to the foreman's clipboard before the foreman arrived. He picked up his pen and said, "Walk me through the terms." He was at his desk on a Thursday morning in October, 3.5 years after the accident, when Denise knocked and said there was a woman in the lobby who did not have an appointment, but said it was important. Denise's expression communicated several things without stating them. Marcus said, "Send her in." Simone came through the door in a gray blazer, professional and composed, and stopped when she saw the office, the 4 rooms visible through the glass partition, the staff at their desks, the framed contracts on the wall, the conference room with its long table, and the Ellison Structural logo on the glass door. She stood in the doorway for a moment with an expression he recognized. It was the expression of someone who has just discovered that a picture they had been living inside was not complete. She sat down across from him. She said she looked good. He said she looked well. She asked how he was. He said he was fine. She had brought a lawyer. Not Whitfield, a different one. A Mooresville attorney who specialized in business valuation disputes. They had filed, she explained, a motion to challenge the divorce settlement on the grounds of undisclosed marital assets. It was her position, her attorney had told her, that the consulting income and the firm's formation had originated in work performed during the marriage and should have been factored into the settlement. Marcus listened to all of this. He let her finish. Then he said, "Celeste." Denise had already called her. Celeste Okafor arrived at 11:15 with a leather briefcase and the particular bearing of an attorney who has been given information she already expected. She sat beside Marcus and across from Simone's attorney and opened the briefcase and began to remove documents in precise stacks. The incorporation date. The business account opening date. The legal separation date. The consulting client records from the 2 years prior, all of which predated the marriage's final year and demonstrated independent income already in progress. The tax filings showing consulting income for each year of the marriage, filed jointly, income Simone had reviewed and signed every April. Celeste said, this firm was incorporated after separation. Its formation capital was derived from savings accumulated in a personal account over the final years of the marriage. savings that your client signed joint tax returns, acknowledging as Mr. Ellison's independent consulting income. There are no undisclosed marital assets. There is a man who built something after your client left. Your motion will be dismissed. Simone's attorney made two more arguments. Celeste addressed both of them with the same unhurried precision, citing case numbers and statutory provisions from memory, and then pointing to the documents in front of him as confirmation. Simone's attorney was competent. He had simply not brought enough. He knew it before the meeting was over. When her attorney went quiet, Simone looked across the desk at Marcus. It was the first time she had looked directly at him since sitting down. He said, "You came here because you heard a number. Someone told you about the valuation." She didn't deny it. He said, "I want to tell you something clearly, and I'm going to say it once. Everything in this building was built after you left. Not to prove something to you. Because it was the work. It was always the work. You spent 12 years in the same house with me, and you never once asked what I thought I was worth if I did it for myself. That was the decision you made, and then you made another one in the hospital. And now the decision you're making today is going to be addressed the same way Celeste addressed it, with the date on the incorporation document, and the date on the separation agreement, and the fact that those two dates are not the same date." He stood. He straightened his jacket. He said, "Denise will show you out." He picked up his legal pad and walked to the conference room and closed the door and looked at the drawings his junior engineers had pinned to the wall. Load-bearing analysis for a warehouse project in Gastonia. He picked up his pen and began to read. The motion was dismissed 47 days later. Simone's attorney had filed a competent brief. Celeste had filed a more precise one. The judge ruled in 11 minutes. Marcus was in Gastonia on a site visit when Celeste called with the result. He thanked her, said goodbye, and put the phone in his pocket, and walked the perimeter of the East Foundation and crouched down near the anchor bolt spacing, and looked at it for a long time. It was correct. He had said it would be. He stood and walked back toward the foreman's trailer, boots on the packed earth, legal pad under his arm, the morning sun flat and clean against the steel framing rising from the site. Denise had left 3 messages about the afternoon schedule. Patricia had emailed about a contractor conference in Raleigh in December. One of the junior engineers had flagged a discrepancy in a column load calculation that Marcus would need to review before end of day. He had work to do. The settlement money Simone had received 3 years earlier was, by all accounts, already diminished. The Mooresville attorney had not worked cheaply. The apartment she had moved into after the house sold was a rental in a complex off Rhea Road. A 1-bedroom, practical, nothing like the Mint Hill house. She had stayed at the healthcare network for 2 more years before the merger that restructured her division and eliminated her position. She was working now, from things, in a marketing contractor role that paid by the project and offered nothing steady. She had not remarried. Whether Darren had remained in the picture after the hospital visits, Marcus did not know and did not ask. What he knew was simpler and more complete than any accounting of her losses. He had built the thing. He had built it in the 14 months she had decided he was finished. And then he had kept building it, and it had grown into something with 7 staff members and 31 clients, and a number on a term sheet that a private equity firm from Atlanta had arrived at through 6 weeks of documentation and analysis. The number was not the point. The work was the point. The number was just what the work looked like from the outside when someone bothered to measure it. He bought a house in the spring of his firm's 4th year. A bungalow in Plaza Midwood, 1940s construction. Original hardwood floors that had been painted over twice, and needed to be stripped and refinished by hand. He did it himself over 4 weekends, renting a drum sander and working methodically from the back of the house to the front. He refinished the porch boards after that, replacing the ones that had softened with new white oak, measuring twice before cutting. He built a set of custom shelves in the study, floor to ceiling on the east wall, designed for a collection of books that had been in storage since the Mint Hill house sold. He put them up on a Sunday in November with Raymond holding the level and handing him screws and talking, as Raymond always did, more or less continuously about everything except what mattered, which was fine, which was how it had always been. The books went up that afternoon. His coffee went cold while he placed them. The light through the study window was long and flat, and came in at a low angle across the spines, and he stood for a moment and looked at it. He went to the kitchen and poured out the cold coffee, and filled the cup again, and stood at the counter, and looked at nothing in particular for a moment. Then, he picked up his legal pad from the counter, where he had set it that morning before the sanding started, and he looked at the top page, a rough floor plan for the shelving unit. Measurements in his own handwriting, calculated out precisely. Everything correct. Everything where it was supposed to be. He set the legal pad down. He picked up his coffee. He went back to the study and sat in the leather chair in the corner that had been his father's, old and worn in the right places, and he read until the light was gone. He did not check his phone. There was nothing in it tonight that required him. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and 2 more for you that I think you'll really like. Now here is the script for the new title. Daniel Reeves was 38 years old when his phone lit up at 2:07 in the morning with a text from his wife's number that was not from his wife. The message read, "She's mine now. Don't wait for her." He was sitting at the kitchen table when it came in. He had been sitting there since midnight, which is what he did when sleep would not come and there was no point pretending otherwise. He came downstairs, poured a glass of water, and sat at the table in the dark and let his mind do what it needed to do until it finished. He was a civil contractor. He was used to problems that required patience. He picked up the phone. He read the message twice. He set it face down on the table. His wife's name was Adrienne. Her boss's name was Grant Coulter. He had been her boss for 2 years at the commercial real estate firm where she worked as a senior analyst. Daniel had met Grant Coulter 3 times, once at a work dinner, once at a company holiday party. Once at a charity gala Adrienne had asked him to attend, and then spent most of the evening standing 15 feet away from. At each of those 3 meetings, Grant Coulter had shaken Daniel's hand and looked at him the way certain men look at other men's things, with a casual, assessing interest that has already decided it would like to possess them. Daniel had registered this. He had said nothing. He was, in the specific way of men who build things for a living, more interested in the evidence than the theory. The evidence was now on his phone at 2:07 a.m. in 14 words. What Grant Coulter did not know, sitting wherever he was sitting with Adrienne's phone in his hand, was that he had just handed Daniel Reeves the only document he would need. Grant Coulter did not know that Daniel had, 3 days earlier, retained a forensic accountant. He did not know that Daniel's older brother Marcus, a family law attorney in Raleigh with 22 years of practice, had already reviewed the marital estate and identified 3 financial irregularities in accounts Adrienne controlled jointly. He did not know that Daniel Reeves had been quiet for 4 months, watching, and that the text message he had just sent would be screenshot, time-stamped, and attached to a legal filing before the end of the week. Grant Coulter had no idea that the man he had just told not to wait was already done waiting. But tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The alarm went off at 5:45 a.m. The morning Daniel met Adrienne's eyes across a job site trailer and understood, without being told, that something had changed in her. That was 4 months before the text. He would not understand that moment fully until later. On that particular morning, he had gotten up the same way he got up every morning. Boots first, then jacket, then the Stanley thermos he filled with black coffee from the pot he set the night before on a timer, so it would be ready. He drove a 2018 Ram 1500 with 94,000 miles and a crack in the passenger side sun visor that he kept meaning to replace and never did. He drove it to the job site in Cary, a commercial mixed-use development his company had been contracted to frame and finish over 9 months. And he parked in the gravel lot beside the trailer and got out and stood for a moment looking at the skeleton of steel and concrete rising from the dirt. He had started Reeves General Contracting 11 years earlier with a personal loan from his mother, a used F-250, and a single residential contract from a homeowner in Durham who had heard about him from a neighbor. His mother had told him, when she handed him the check, to build something that would last. He had taken the instruction literally. 11 years later, Reeves General Contracting had 23 employees, a fleet of 8 vehicles, and a portfolio of completed commercial projects that had earned the firm a reputation in the Triangle area for coming in on time and on specification. He was not famous. He was not rich by the standards of the industry's upper tier. He was dependable, and dependability in construction was its own kind of currency. He had met Adrienne 7 years ago at a neighborhood block party in Raleigh, where they had ended up standing next to each other at the food table, because they had both arrived late and the seating was gone. She was smart and direct, and laughed at the right things. She had opinions about city planning that she expressed without apology. She worked in commercial real estate and understood the built environment in a way that most people he met did not. And he had found, for the first time in a long time, that he was talking to someone who understood the logic of what he did without needing it explained. They were married the following year. The early years were good. She understood his hours. He understood her ambition. They had built a life in a craftsman house in North Raleigh that he had renovated himself over 2 years. New kitchen, refinished floors, a wraparound porch he designed and built from scratch on winter weekends. They did not have children. They had talked about it and arrived, without drama, at the understanding that they were each other's primary commitment, and that this was enough. He could not name the exact month things changed. He could name the approximate season. It was the spring of the previous year, shortly after Adrienne was promoted to senior analyst and began working more directly with Grant Coulter on portfolio acquisitions. The late evenings started then, the work dinners she described in summary rather than detail. The way she sometimes looked at her phone and then turned it slightly, not dramatically, just the particular casual adjustment of someone redirecting a screen without making a production of it. He noticed. He always noticed. It was the same faculty that made him a good contractor. The ability to see a discrepancy between what something was supposed to be and what it actually was. A measurement off by 3/16 of an inch. A load-bearing calculation that assumed a material grade the actual material didn't meet. He could spot these things in drawings before they appeared in structure. He was less practiced at spotting them in people, but the instinct was the same. Something was off. The calculation wasn't matching the material. Grant Coulter's name appeared with increasing frequency that spring. Not flagrantly. Regularly, he was referenced in the way that people reference something they are trying not to reference too often. With measured casualness. With a studied offhandedness that is itself a kind of signal. Grant thinks the South Point portfolio is undervalued. Grant had some interesting ideas about the Durham Development Corridor. Daniel listened. He said very little. He was not a man who moved quickly when he was still gathering information. He moved on the information he had the Friday before the text arrived. His brother Marcus was not only a family law attorney, he was also the person Daniel called when he needed to think through something he didn't want to get wrong. He called him from his truck in the parking lot of the job site. Engine off, windows up, in the specific privacy of a vehicle in a parking lot that feels like the one truly sealed space available to a man who lives and works around other people constantly. He told Marcus everything methodically, in the order it had happened, without editorializing. Marcus listened all the way through without interrupting. Then Marcus said, "How long have you known?" Daniel said, "Known for certain? Since last Tuesday. Suspected since April." Marcus said, "Tell me about the accounts." Daniel told him about the accounts. Joint savings, joint investment portfolio, a business account Adrienne had co-signing access to that they had set up 3 years earlier for a rental property they owned together. He told Marcus about the $34,000 that had moved out of the joint investment portfolio over 9 months in transfers below the threshold that would trigger automatic notification. He had found it going through the year-end statements with the same methodical attention he brought to contractor invoicing, not looking for it, finding it the way he found discrepancies in everything, because he actually looked. Marcus said, "Don't touch the accounts. Don't move anything. Don't say anything to her yet. I'm going to refer you to a forensic accountant I use. Call him Monday." Daniel said, "Okay." Marcus said, "Are you all right?" Daniel was quiet for a moment. He said, "I'm doing the math." Marcus understood what that meant. It meant his brother was not going to fall apart. It meant the thing behind Daniel's face that looked like stillness was actually calculation. He had seen it since they were boys. He said, "Call me after you talk to the accountant." The forensic accountant's name was Howard Briggs. He worked out of a quiet office in downtown Raleigh with bookshelves that covered 3 walls and a desk that was immaculately clear except for whatever he was currently working on. He was 61, precise, and regarded financial records with the same focused attention Daniel brought to structural drawings. They met on Wednesday morning. Daniel brought the account statements, 3 years of them, organized by date in a blue folder he had labeled in his own handwriting. Howard Briggs looked through them for 40 minutes without speaking. Then he said, "$34,000 is the number you found." Daniel said, "Yes." Howard Briggs said, "There's more." He walked Daniel through it. 14 months of incremental transfers, some to accounts Daniel couldn't immediately identify, some to a credit card that was in Adrienne's name alone and that Daniel had not known existed. The total across all accounts and instruments, when Howard Briggs laid it out on a single sheet and a column with dates, was $61,400. It had been moved with the particular care of someone who understood financial monitoring thresholds. Not a lump sum. Never a single transfer above $4,000. Steady, deliberate, patient, the architecture of someone who had been planning an exit. Howard Briggs circled the total at the bottom of the column and set the sheet in front of Daniel. Daniel looked at it. He sat with it the way he sat with any structural problem, quietly, without rushing the conclusion. Then he took a photograph of the sheet with his phone and put the folder back in his bag. He said, "How long will the formal report take?" Howard Briggs said, "A week. I'll be thorough." Daniel said, "Be thorough." He drove back to the job site and put on his jacket and walked the building. He checked the east elevation framing, which his crew chief had flagged for a minor deviation in the header alignment. He crouched down and looked at the base plate for the structural column at grid point C4 and verified the anchor bolt placement against the drawings. He marked 2 items on his legal pad. He clipped a note to the crew chief's clipboard. He worked until 6. He did not say anything to Adrienne when he came home. She was at the kitchen island with her laptop open and a glass of wine and said dinner was in the oven. He said thank you. He washed his hands. They ate together at the kitchen table with a television on in the other room and talked about ordinary things. A neighbor's renovation project, a weekend she mentioned she would need to work through, a conference in Charlotte in 2 weeks that she said was required attendance. He said, "When is it?" She said, "The 14th and 15th. He said, "I'll manage the weekend." She looked at him for a moment. He was eating. She went back to her food. That night, he could not sleep. He came downstairs at midnight and sat at the kitchen table in the dark and thought through what he knew and what he still needed and what the sequence should be. He thought about Howard Briggs's column of numbers with the total circled at the bottom. He thought about the rental property and the joint accounts and what Marcus had said about asset preservation. He thought about the craftsman house and the wraparound porch and the floors he had refinished by hand. At 2:07 a.m., his phone lit up on the table in front of him. He picked it up. He read the message. He turned it face down on the table. He sat for another moment. Then he turned it back over, opened the screenshot function, and documented the message with the timestamp visible. He forwarded it to Marcus. He forwarded it to his own email. He set the phone down and picked up his glass of water. He thought 14 words. He thought, that's enough. He went back upstairs at 3:15. He did not sleep, but he lay in the dark with the particular stillness of a man who has finished deciding. Adrienne was asleep beside him, breathing steadily. He looked at the ceiling. He thought about the job site in Cary and the header alignment on the east elevation and the anchor bolt at C4 and all the small precise things that would need to be correct before the building could bear weight. He was up at 5:45. He made coffee. He filled the Stanley thermos and screwed the lid tight. He drove to the job site. He called Marcus from the parking lot at 6:15, before anyone else arrived. Marcus picked up immediately. He said, "I got the forward." Daniel said, "That's the text." Marcus said, "That's a gift. That is a man handing you the case." Daniel said, "I know." Marcus said, "This changes the posture entirely. Adultery is on the table now. The asset dissipation plus the marital misconduct, depending on the judge, changes the equitable distribution calculation. I want you in my office Friday morning. Bring everything Howard gave you. Bring the forward of the text." Daniel said, "I'll be there." Marcus said, "Daniel." Daniel said, "I'm all right." Marcus said, "I know you are. That's what I'm counting on." He had the formal report from Howard Briggs by Thursday afternoon, 14 pages, single-spaced, with annotated account records and a summary table that documented $61,400 in dissipated marital assets across an 18-month period. He put it in the same blue folder with the account statements and drove to Marcus's office in Raleigh on Friday morning. Marcus's office was on the 4th floor of a building off Glenwood Avenue, a corner suite with 2 windows that looked over the street below. He had been practicing family law for 22 years, and the walls of his office held case files organized by year going back to 2004, and photographs of his 2 daughters, and a single-framed photograph of Daniel and Marcus as boys standing in front of their mother's house. He had a methodical, unhurried manner in client meetings that was either reassuring or unnerving depending on which side of the table you were on. On this particular Friday morning, Daniel was on the comfortable side. Marcus went through the folder document by document. He spent 11 minutes on Howard Briggs's report. He looked at the text message screenshot for a long time. He said, "Grant Coulter sent this from her phone." Daniel said, "Yes." Marcus said, "Which means either she handed it to him or he had unsupervised access to it while she was present." Daniel said, "Yes." Marcus said, "Either way, this is corroboration. This goes in the filing." He set the screenshot down. "I'm going to be honest with you. The asset dissipation alone gave us leverage. The text gives us clarity. It removes any argument that the relationship began after separation." He sent this from her phone at 2 in the morning. That is not a professional relationship that got complicated. That is a concluded arrangement. Daniel looked at the photograph of himself and his brother on the wall. He was maybe 10 in the photograph. Marcus was 13. They were standing in front of their mother's house, with the particular squinting expression of boys looking into afternoon sun. He said, "What's the sequence?" Marcus walked him through it. Filing first, before any conversation with Adrienne. Emergency asset freeze on the joint accounts to prevent further dissipation. Formal discovery request that would include Adrienne's communications with Grant Coulter during business hours on company devices. A request Marcus intended to serve not only to Adrienne, but to the real estate firm itself, which would create a secondary problem for Grant Coulter that lived outside the divorce proceeding entirely. Companies employing executives who conducted personal affairs on company time and company devices had their own exposure. Marcus knew 2 attorneys at the firm's general counsel. He intended to make a phone call. Daniel said, "Will that affect her employment?" Marcus said, "That depends on how the firm responds. It might. I want you to understand that going in." Daniel looked at the window. He said, "She moved $61,000. She moved it in pieces because she knew I'd notice a lump sum. She planned this for 18 months. Marcus said nothing. Daniel said, "Make the call." The filing landed on a Tuesday. Adrienne received service at the real estate firm's offices at 10:45 a.m. Marcus had arranged it that way specifically, not for dramatic effect, but because serving at the residence risked an uncontrolled confrontation, and Marcus preferred controlled conditions. The emergency asset freeze was granted by 2:00 p.m. The same afternoon, the discovery request went to the firm's general counsel at 4:30. Daniel was on the job site in Cary when Marcus texted him, "Filed. Freeze granted. GC served." He read it, standing at the base of the east elevation, chalk marker in his hand. He put the phone back in his jacket pocket. He looked at the header alignment his crew chief had flagged and crouched down to examine the bearing point. It was off by 1/4 inch. He marked it in orange chalk, wrote the correction on his legal pad, and clipped it to the clipboard by the crew chief's station. He went back to work. Grant Coulter's response to the general counsel inquiry was swift and, Marcus reported, extremely clarifying. The firm's general counsel had initiated an internal review within 48 hours of receiving the discovery request. The review identified 17 months of personal communications conducted on company devices, 3 instances of client entertainment expenses that appeared in the firm's accounts and corresponded to dates Adrienne had described to Daniel as work dinners, and 1 instance in which Grant Coulter had used the firm's corporate account to book a hotel room in Charlotte that appeared on no legitimate business record. The firm placed Grant Coulter on administrative leave pending the outcome of the review. His attorney called Marcus on a Thursday to discuss the discovery request. Marcus described the conversation later as brief. He said Grant Coulter's attorney had used the phrase, "Let's find a way to make this straightforward" 3 times in 11 minutes. Marcus had been polite. He had said discovery would proceed as filed. Adrienne's attorney, a family law practitioner from Kerry who had been retained, Daniel gathered, sometime in the 48 hours after service, contacted Marcus to request a settlement conference. Marcus agreed to a date 6 weeks out. He told Daniel the request was a good sign. Daniel said, "Why?" Marcus said, "Because she knows what the text message is. She knows what Howard's report is. She knows what the internal review at the firm is going to produce." Her attorney told her to settle. Her attorney is right. Daniel said, "What are we asking for?" Marcus told him, "The full $61,400 in the distribution." The rental property, which had been purchased primarily with Daniel's premarital savings, and which Marcus intended to argue should revert entirely to Daniel's column. The marital home equity split, but with the dissipation factored in, weighted in Daniel's favor. Adrienne's retirement accounts accrued during the marriage split according to standard equitable distribution. Nothing more. Daniel said, "The house." Marcus said, "What about it?" Daniel said, "I built that house. Not metaphorically. I built it with my hands over 2 years. I want the right of first purchase at current appraisal if it goes to sale." Marcus said. Done. The settlement conference was held on a Wednesday morning in Marcus's conference room. A clean rectangular space with pale oak furniture and a window that looked toward the building's interior courtyard. Adrienne came with her attorney. She was dressed professionally, composed in the way of someone who had been preparing for a difficult thing and was committed to getting through it with their posture intact. She did not look at Daniel when she sat down. Marcus sat beside Daniel with the blue folder open in front of him and a fresh yellow legal pad. Adrienne's attorney opened with their position, a standard equitable distribution split, no special weight for the dissipation, an argument that the text message was ambiguous and did not constitute proof of an established pre-separation relationship. Marcus let him finish. Then he removed 3 documents from the folder and set them in a row in front of Adrienne's attorney. Howard Briggs's report. The time-stamped screenshot, a 12-page summary from the firm's internal review that the general counsel had, and a development Marcus had described to Daniel as professionally elegant, provided to Marcus voluntarily as part of their own legal positioning against Grant Coulter. Marcus said, "We have 18 months of documented asset dissipation. A text message sent from your client's phone at 2:07 a.m. by her employer that corroborates an ongoing relationship predating any separation, and a corporate internal review that independently corroborates the timeline. We are not arguing for punitive distribution. We are arguing for accurate distribution. The $61,400 that was moved out of the marital estate belongs in Mr. Reeves's column. The rental property, purchased primarily with premarital funds, reverts to Mr. Reeves. The marital home goes to appraisal with Mr. Taftrey. Reeves holding right of first purchase. Everything else by the standard formula." Adrienne's attorney looked at the documents. He made a note on his own pad. He asked for 15 minutes. He and Adrienne left the room. They came back in 12. Her attorney said, "We're prepared to accept the distribution as proposed with one modification on the retirement accounts." Marcus looked at Daniel. Daniel said, "What's the modification?" It was minor. Marcus accepted it. They signed the preliminary agreement at 11:43 a.m. Adrienne stood when it was done and gathered her things. At the door she stopped. She turned around and looked at Daniel for the first time since she had sat down. She said, "I didn't tell him to send that." Daniel looked at her. He said, "I know." She waited. He didn't say anything else. She left. He sat for a moment after her attorney followed her out. Marcus was gathering documents. The courtyard outside the window was empty, pale morning light on the pavement. Marcus said. "You okay?" Daniel said, "Yeah." Marcus said, "You sure?" Daniel looked at the window. He said, "She moved $61,000, and she did it carefully enough that she thought I wouldn't find it." And then he sent 14 words from her phone and made it simple. He paused. "I don't know whether to be angry at him for that or not." Marcus said, "Don't be anything at him. He's not your problem anymore." Daniel said, "No." He picked up the blue folder and put it in his bag. He put on his jacket. He shook his brother's hand. He drove back to the job site in Cary. Grant Coulter's administrative leave became a termination 6 weeks after the internal review concluded. The firm's exposure from the corporate account discrepancies and the entertainment expense irregularities had been significant enough that the parting was not negotiated gently. His departure from the firm was noted in 2 commercial real estate industry newsletters in language that was brief and bloodless, and that anyone who knew how to read such notices would understand completely. Adrienne remained at the firm. She was not implicated in the financial irregularities. She retained her position. She was, from what Marcus heard through the professional networks that carry these things quietly, working under a new portfolio manager and performing well enough. Whether she had understood what Grant Coulter was, or had simply chosen not to look, Daniel neither knew nor asked. It was not his problem. Marcus had said that. He had been right. The divorce was finalized on a Friday in March. The rental property transferred to Daniel's sole ownership. He exercised the right of first purchase on the Craftsman house in North Raleigh at the appraised value, taking on the mortgage balance himself and buying out Adrienne's the same way he did all financial analysis. Methodically, with a legal pad, sitting at the kitchen table in the dark, and the numbers worked. He could carry it. He intended to. He walked through the house the Saturday after the transfer was complete. Not to inventory it, not for any practical reason. He walked it the way he walked a finished job site, from room to room, looking at what had been built, checking the detail work against the original intention. The kitchen he had gutted and rebuilt over 4 weekends 6 years ago, with the soapstone counters and the open shelving he had constructed from reclaimed oak. The floors he had refinished to their original color, a warm amber that appeared in the morning light through the east-facing windows, with a consistency he had been particularly satisfied with. The wraparound porch he had designed and framed and finished himself, the railing posts cut and set to a spacing that was slightly tighter than standard, because he had wanted the geometry to be right. He stood on the porch in the early morning and drank his coffee and looked at the street. The ROM was in the driveway. The sun was coming up behind the trees at the far end of the block. The light was that particular quality of early spring light that is still thin but already different from winter, different in its angle, different in its warmth, already becoming something else. His phone buzzed. A site notification from the crew chief in Cary, a material delivery question that needed a decision before the morning started. He looked at it for a moment. He typed his answer. He put the phone in his jacket pocket. He picked up the thermos. He drank the last of the coffee. He stood on the porch he had built and looked at the street and did not think about anything in particular for a moment that was long enough to be useful. Then he went inside. He rinsed the thermos. He laced his boots. He drove to Cary. The crew chief was already on site when he arrived. The material delivery question had resolved correctly. Daniel walked the east elevation and looked at the header correction he had marked in orange chalk 2 weeks earlier. It had been addressed precisely. He made a note on his legal pad. He clipped the sheet to the foreman's board. He walked the building from south to north and back, boots on the packed earth, the steel and concrete rising above him into a clear March morning. Everything plumb and true, and bearing weight the way it was designed to bear it. His name was on the contract. His stamp was on the drawings. Everything in this building had been checked by someone who actually looked. He did not look back at the parking lot. There was nothing behind him worth looking at. I hope you enjoyed that one. It's the next story. I've picked out two